So when I grew up, where I grew up, small Appalachian town in Ohio, I grew up living on a hill. And all around me there were hills because it was, again, the foothills of Appalachia. Very beautiful, very picturesque, and it was great. And I'm not talking about little hills. No, I'm talking about the kind of hills that kids dream about when it comes to riding sleds. I mean, that was what I did in the winter. We would pray for snow days and that the plows wouldn't come down our hill. My sister and I, we would pray this prayer so that we would be able to sled down a big, steep hill. And even after that one, then you had to make this little turn and go down another hill, and then you just had to walk back up. It was amazing, the hills and the speed that were around me as a kid doing all this stuff. And we always had these great spots for riding sleds. Not so good when it comes to trying to learn how to ride a bicycle. It's not very great. You can kind of do it with training wheels, but eventually, as everyone knows, the training wheels have to come off, and you can't really get the basics down of riding a bike if you have to go down a hill. That is at least, I think, like lesson 2, after you learn not to fall off the bike, which is hard to do going down a hill. This is all to say that when I was growing up, I remember very vividly, I had a hard time learning how to ride a bike. I would fall, and then I would get back on, and I would fall again, and I would get back on, and I would fall again, repeat. This was upsetting, to say the least, because I really wanted to learn how to ride a bike. It's a natural childhood passage that people have to go through, that you learn how to ride a bike. And so my father, in his infinite wisdom, had the greatest solution ever. He packed up my bike, packed up my sister's bike, and we rode. And we went to a nice, flat, gravel road. Now, if you're groaning about someone who's not good at riding bikes, learning how to ride bikes on a gravel road, let me just say this. Yes, I know, because I too am in the future. My skills being very lacking caused me to fall a number of times, not just on a regular road, but now we are on a dirt gravel road. There were cuts, there were scrapes all over my legs, and my dad, ever stoic, would just say, "Get up and try again." And eventually, from this painful experience, I learned how to stay on the bike. And I was very glad with the lesson. I thought that it was great. And I was so overjoyed after learning this lesson. I was so excited. There was a sense of freedom. There is no freer person in the world than a child who learns how to ride their bike. The world has literally become the oyster. I can go anywhere that I want until the streetlights come on at night. And I was ecstatic. I celebrated this fact. I rode my bike as often as I could around the neighborhood with no place to go in particular because I was so excited that I had finally learned how to ride a bike, and that is where we find ourselves today. No, not riding bikes per se, but we find ourselves in this incredible amount of joy because it's Palm Sunday. And Palm Sunday is one of the happiest days of the year. You see, looking at our passage in Isaiah, it's very clear that this all points to Jesus. You can look at it and say, okay, obviously, this is Jesus, a humble teacher gifted by God, was obedient to God that none could stand against. And that is, of course, Jesus, because we're in the future. We know how this all plays out. The power of who Jesus is, the might, the glory of this person. Jesus is this figure that could change the world, and in fact did change the world. This man was a man from God who had come to right the wrongs of the world. So how can you not be super excited about Jesus Christ? When you know who Jesus is, when you've seen what Jesus can do and what Jesus is doing, how then can you not be ecstatic? How can you not be filled with joy? If you know who Jesus is, if you know what Jesus is about, then it all makes sense to us. Jesus is the wisest teacher to ever come from God. I am not saying that there are not other good teachers who came from God. I mean, I'll rattle off a few. John Calvin, Karl Barth, even Wesley sometimes. They're all great teachers. None of them compare to what Jesus Christ has done. Absolutely none of them. There are none that can stand up to the power and might and majesty and the glory of who Christ is, because Jesus Christ is not just some really nice young hippie guy. No, Jesus Christ is the Son of God, the same substance of the Godhead, put in a way that we can understand this God. And this right here is why Palm Sunday is so important to us. This glorious, wonderful day, because Jesus sets his sight on Jerusalem. And Jesus knows what's going to happen. Jesus is looking into the future, remembering everything that has happened and everything that is going to happen. And Jesus says, I'm going there to die. I am going to Jerusalem to be the atoning sacrifice for the sins of the world. It's always striking how Jesus is almost nonchalant about this whole thing. It's very interesting. Now, it's interesting to note that this is a royal procession, and the very act of Jesus riding in a royal procession is an act of treason against the Roman Empire. But it's weird, because he's on a donkey. See, donkeys were this sort of way that when a king shows up on a donkey and not on the horse, you know that they're there for peace. They are not there for war. So Jesus coming in on a donkey, one of the weirdest and goofiest looking animals ever, is a sign saying, I have come peacefully. A declaration that Jesus intends no harm to anyone, but the crowd erupts into turmoil. Some people are crazy excited because the prophet Jesus has come. Others are worried about what this means politically, and they are scratching their heads figuring, oh great, now we're going to make the Romans mad, and we have to deal with that. And yet, in all of this, it almost seems to me that how Jesus shows up is less important than the fact that Jesus shows up. It's more important that Jesus showed up. See, because if Jesus knows exactly what's going on as he's peering through the looking glass and seeing into the future, if he understands what he is about to do and what he is about to endure, then he has the ability, knowing the future, to change the future, and yet he does not, because that does not go along with God's plan. You see, he gets it. Jesus understands what this week is going to entail. He understands this, and yet in this moment, it's almost like none of that, none of the pain, none of the suffering, the humiliation, the multiple betrayals, none of that seems to matter. Because Jesus is there. In the midst of all of this, we know that Jesus is showing up to die. And we know how this story ends: beaten, bruised, and bloody. But it doesn't matter that the worst is yet to come. What matters is that Jesus is there, ready to accomplish all that he has to do in the midst of this upcoming terror. He takes time out to just revel in the pure joy of the people that are surrounding him. It's very poignant for this time of the year, don't you think? Just the way that, we find ourselves looking ahead to the future, and every time you watch the news, it's like, the peak hasn't hit, the worst is still coming, y'all gotta wear masks, y'all gotta do this, y'all gotta do that. Just bad news and bad news and bad news, and we know that it's coming. It's sort of like this anxiety bubble that just keeps growing in the pit of us, and yet none of that matters. And the reason none of that matters is that Jesus is there. We celebrate in the midst of what may come, in the midst of what will come. We celebrate. We get loud. We get excited. Louder than we have ever been before. I want this to be the loudest Palm Sunday on record. At 12 o'clock today, the governor of Maryland has requested a time of prayer, and all of the church bells are going to be ringing at noon, and I'm going to be ringing our bells here, and it's going to be this loud, wonderful, beautiful cacophony of noise saying, Lord Jesus, come. But Jesus is already there. In the midst of what is going on, in the midst of everything that is going on outside the walls of our houses, of our churches, of our business places, all of that, Jesus Christ is here now. This is why we celebrate. This is why we sing our loud songs of praise. We know that Jesus is here for us right now. And according to Isaiah, who can contend with Jesus? And the answer is no one. Nothing in this world is stronger than the power of Jesus Christ, of the hope that Jesus gives us, of being able to walk out the door, even though you're scared and terrified and you're anxious and you're upset because it's Palm Sunday and you're surrounded by stuffed animals. None of that matters because Jesus Christ is here now. And we know that Jesus is rescuing us from the darkness and the death and the hell that is to come. Because that is what Jesus Christ does. Yeah, it's weird this year. It's super weird this year. Trust me, I get it. It's different and it's weird, and I would love for things to be different, but they're not. And even though I want that to be the case, none of that matters because the kingdom of heaven is here now. There is no reason not to be excited and filled with joy on this day. So we celebrate. We celebrate who Jesus is, what Jesus has done, what Jesus is doing, and what Jesus is doing into the future, because the best part of Holy Week is that it is the beginning, not the end of anything. The best part of all of this is that the best is yet to come. Amen.